Well, good afternoon. If this is working,
I think it is.
try this again in case it isn't, because we're still dealing with a little bit new or old technology. But this is Mark Tallman.
Leah Fighter.
We're bringing you our weekly grand YouTube live
That's
production,
right.
not a Facebook live. It has been a very busy week, so things may kind of fall together a little bit. But thank you for joining us whenever you are viewing. Maybe just a quick note of where we are. Next Monday is the last day for committees to meet before turnaround. Turnaround means that most bills, those that are not exempt, have to have passed the first house, their house of origin, or are dead for the session. So the legislature will be meeting Monday or in committee. Then they will Tuesday, Wednesday, and possibly Thursday, kind of depending on the schedule, be having to work whatever bills they're going to work. So we're going to be telling you a lot of things that are coming out of committee, a few more that may come out of committee. That doesn't mean they'll get to the floor. We don't know what will happen on the floor, but this is part of that process. So why don't we just kind of begin by talking about a couple of the real top line issues, then we'll just sort of kind of go through our list of bills where they are. And we may just want to start with the issue of at-risk funding, the high density at-risk, and some of the things associated with that. As I think everyone knows, several years ago, the legislature put a sunset clause on, high density at-risk.
For those of you who don't know, sunset means this law or this section is going to end on a certain date.
Unless the legislature extends it. Exactly. So if the legislature does nothing, $50 million in funding for districts with higher levels of student poverty will go away. So this happened to come the same year that the legislature had scheduled an audit of at-risk funding. That audit, much disputed, I guess is the charitable way to put it, but basically said that the auditors were concerned that the state board and districts were not following state law regarding kind of the documentation of at-risk programs. Are they evidence-based? Is there an oversight? They really didn't reach any conclusions about whether they were actually doing any good or not. But the question was, are you following the requirements in state law, which says the State Board of Education is supposed to approve everything and they're supposed to be evidence-based programs. So this has been a point of discussion from the beginning. Yesterday evening, the House K-12 Budget Committee voted to recommend House Bill 2540, which, as introduced, did not do anything with the sunset, but was amended last evening to push the sunset out 5 years. So instead of just getting rid of it and saying, okay, at-risk funding will be around forever unless the legislature acts, they're basically saying we're gonna let it last another 5 years, but we're gonna look at it. We're gonna make sure we come back. That bill originally made a couple of changes in all at-risk funding. Now, again, keep in mind that under state law, districts already are supposed to have state board approval for any at-risk program.
I think those are under their ESSA plans.
That's right, but that's correct. But the way the state board has done it is to allow districts to basically, as part of their consolidated plan or their for federal programs under ESSA, they could sort of say, here's what we're using our at-risk funds for. Here's our programs. Here's our results. Legislators and the auditor, some legislators at least, and the audit kind of said, well, that's not really the right order. And so this bill says you must spend your money only on programs that are approved and posted on a list of approved. You could go to the state board website and find out, is this program approved before you use it? One of the concerns that several education groups raised, and I think several organizations went together in testimony that I think I delivered, it's been a long couple of weeks, that said, you know, the problem is, what if a district may have a promising program they found some evidence on, but it's not on the state board's list? Do we shut that off? So the committee made an amendment which created what they call provisional program, which says a district can operate a year under a program they find promising and then let the state board decide whether to put it on the list or not. The second major concern that we had was that the wording of the bill implied you would have to document results from every particular program or intervention. Well, if you're using multiple programs and practices, how would you separate those out? So the amendment essentially said you need to report the overall academic performance and other indicators and standards for all your at-risk students, but you don't have to try to say, well, this much was a result of JAG, this much was a result of MTSS or something like that. So while certainly I think there will probably still be some concerns about this, it is not as big a change from current law as originally introduced. So I think we at least need to commend the committee for listening and trying to address some of those concerns. And it is now linked to the extension, but not the permanent extension.
Right.
So that's what the House is doing. The Senate has been working on Senate Bill 271, and I think you've been following that. And I think the short answer is they haven't finished. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So 271 was introduced as a way to simply remove the sunset. Very simple bill to do that. In earlier discussion, the committee has amended it to have a 2-year extension of the sunset, I believe.
I'm double checking.
Yeah, thank you for doing that, a 2-year. And that's really all it does at this point, but they're going to consider it in the Senate Education Committee. And on the same day, Monday, they're to discuss Senate Bill 353, which is a bill, again, a little hard to know the actual impact, directing school boards and administrators to look at building-based needs assessment already required by state law. Hope you're all doing those, because that is supposed to inform how you make budget decisions, and then the dollars are supposed to be allocated to reasonably calculated to achieve the Rose standards, which is language basically from state law and Supreme Court rulings.
This was the KPI bill, correct?
Well, the only proponent was Kansas Policy Institute. And again, in our discussion, we're not really clear it necessarily requires something different. Certainly the implication is that a problem is allocation of dollars. You know, we thought a lot of concerns about the way that's being presented. So those are separate bills at this time, but since they're both to be considered on Monday, there's certainly a chance that some type of what some legislators will feel is more accountability or more direction may be brought in. So good news is I think the legislature is intending to extend the sunset. There's really no talk about saying we're going to let it die, but everyone is saying, again, majorities to this point are certainly saying, but we need some additional accountability, restrictions, requirements. So we'll be following those. Anything you need to add to that?
Nope.
All right, and of course, we'll invite our studio audience, if we're forgetting anything, to do that here in our less formal setting. The second issue that is probably drawing a great deal of concern is special education funding.
Yes.
That goes back to the fact that when the new official estimates of school finance costs were released this fall, because student enrollment was lower than originally expected, that saves money, as you all probably know. In a pupil-based funding system, if enrollment is lower, whether weighted or actual, doesn't cost as much. So it turns out the finance formula approved last year to satisfy the Supreme Court will cost about roughly $30 to $40 million less, while still funding base state aid as predicted. State Board of Education has suggested using that money to boost special education state aid. Supposed to be at 92% according to state law. Now it's down around 70 and dropping. Put that back in. So the various budget committees have worked on that. Here's where we are. I'll do my understanding. You jump in. Both committees have now said they want to defer that till omnibus. Now, what does that mean?
That means later, after we get the April consensus revenue estimates, the legislature comes back from kind of a spring break and re-looks at the numbers and adjusts their budget bills accordingly. Absolutely. So the legislature is now kind of working on the governor's budget, making relatively few changes. They're not willing to spend $40 million more now, but they're not saying no. The House in particular is asking the governor to do a budget amendment, which I guess would formally put the governor on record as saying, I want to do this and to allow the budget to balance. She has not done it to that point. So the House K-12 Budget Committee made that recommendation last night. The Senate Ways and Means Committee today took action, did they not? Not on this.
That's great. They'd already approved this, but they did their final.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Sorry about that as I continue to fight the consumption
dreaded cough.
that I'm dealing with. A couple of other things that, again, if you really want arcane budget stuff, we will note. No, we won't even worry about that.
Yeah,
right
let's
now.
not go there.
The bottom line is both groups have not said yes to additional
And they've
special
not said
education.
no.
They've not said no, and so keep
Carry
talking,
on.
carry on, do all of that. Couple of other, maybe the third kind of big issue that has drawn a lot of attention is an adjustment to our capital improvement aid system.
That's right.
You know, this is one that really wasn't getting much discussion before the session, but now, kind of surprisingly and unanimously, committees are pushing out to do something. So here's the essence, as simple as we can make it. In 2015, the formula was changed so that your aid ratio, which means what percent of your bond payments is paid by the state, is all keyed to the lowest assessed valuation per pupil in the state. Whoever the lowest valuation is gets 75% of their aid paid for. For every $1,000 in valuation, that percentage drops. Well, here's
$1,000 in valuation above that.
Right, above that. So
artificial.
That's right. So if the lowest is, I don't know, $1,000 per pupil, if it at $2,000 per pupil,
you get 76% or
whatever. Well, 74.
Yeah, 74.
The next lowest tends to be around the 20s. Well, here's the problem. The lowest valuation per pupil now and in the foreseeable future is Fort Leavenworth, because they really don't have any valuation per pupil. Being a military base, there's apparently a heavily taxed Burger King, is essentially
and a railroad easement or
something like that is the only thing that raises any money for them. And by state law, they cannot have a bond issue.
That's right.
So, but then you jump all the way up to somewhere in like the mid 20s, meaning effectively about the highest percent of state aid you can get is around 50%, in that range. But here's the problem. Most other districts, valuation grows over time. You get a second Burger King. You build some homes. All of that happens, and so your valuation grows. Those things happen. Doesn't happen in Dr. Heim gets a Dairy Queen or something like that. So what we've seen is, since this has happened, every year some districts drop off the state aid list, and other districts get a lower percentage paid. So both, may I have the numbers, Leah, please? No, you'll have to look them up for me. SB 382 in the Senate, and House Bill. While she's looking up that House bill, both of these bills, as introduced, would simply remove Fort Leavenworth for future calculations. And that would mean that the 75% aid ratio would start at the second lowest effective district in the state. This will have the impact of two things. Number one, increasing state bond and interest aid. Number two, it will be more likely to not have the disequalization occurred when your formula is tied to an entity that doesn't move and everyone else does move. So the bottom line is, both the House K-12 Budget Committee and the Senate Education Committee have now both recommended that a change be made. The full committee report on either is not available, so we don't have absolutely all the details of any amendments. We'll be studying those, but again, the good news is, at least for future bond issues that you may want to do, right now there seems to be some building legislative support in this area.
That's right.
Those are probably, yes, we have a question.
Some people were concerned about looking back 5 years.
There is discussion of doing that. Leah, do you know?
In fact, in the Senate this morning, they did, in Senate Ed, they adopted an amendment taking it back to 2015 from 2020.
So that would be obviously helpful to many more districts. That also adds to the cost.
Right.
And so,
although it takes down your property tax, right?
Yeah, well, yes, it's a cost to the state.
It's a cost to the state.
To the hard-pressed Kansas property taxpayer in districts with new buildings. It's
right.
a great deal. So those issues are, so again, we will review the final versions of bills that pass through. But again, it looks like the most conservative approach, if you will, the least costly to the state, would provide this relief going forward. The Senate version would provide a look back, and if even if those are the versions that pass the chambers this week, that would create a possibility
Right.
for some sort of compromise in there.
Compromise.
The other thing, Leah, I don't know, was the discussion, I believe, in the Senate with the look back would remove virtual enrollment from the calculation.
Yes, and they did adopt that amendment today. So you are assessed on your actual physical students in your buildings, not your virtual students.
Under the theory that virtual students
Don't cause wear and tear.
Don't cause wear and tear or need extra space or whatever. Believe the calculation was with the more generous aid ratio, everyone still comes out ahead.
I believe so.
But not as much perhaps
Right.
as you might have. So again, positive move so far. Okay, Leah, let's move to a couple of other issues. I think one thing that happened today was the dual or concurrent enrollment.
Yes, that's Senate Bill 335 that we've been following for you. It was the subject of several amendments today in Senate Ed. None of them overly concerning to us. The First Amendment added kids who are on either an IEP or an individual plan of study to the students who can have their fees paid. Also, something that I thought was very interesting and a good idea, it extends the tuition waiver for that foster care kids receive if they have aged out of foster care. It extends that waiver to high school students who are still in foster care who want to take advantage of these dual enrollment classes. It also has some reporting requirements about, making sure parents or students know if they're interested in a course that is not a system-wide requirement, to make sure they know that, if you take this, it might not transfer to that college across the state that you want to attend, or, that kind of thing. There are some reporting requirements around making sure you note, if you have foster kids who are taking advantage of that, note that number, how many students are taking advantage, and how much money the local district is providing for those fees, if any. Again, remember, this doesn't require you to pay those fees. It allows you to. It also, there was an amendment adopted today that just makes it very clear that the money, the fees generated for Senate Bill 155 courses, the CTE courses, are completely separate from this, just to make sure
Right,
that everybody knows.
because those are already tuition free.
Those are already tuition free. They just, I think there was just some,
right.
Concerns expressed in committee about this is kind of confusing.
And just in case, because it's been a long week, we haven't mentioned it, just a reminder, if you're new to this discussion, the interpretation of current law is that you cannot use general fund dollars to pay for student tuition. And some districts are doing it by using other monies, foundation money.
Foundation or something.
Maybe some are just doing it and have not been audited. I don't know. I've talked to some community college people who say, well, there's a lot of this going on, but you can, the school district can pay money to a partner institution. The ruling was they couldn't pay the student tuition.
Right.
And that's what this would change. And so this is something KASB is supporting.
Yeah.
Leah, you mentioned foster care, and there's a bill there we may want to mention too.
Yes, it's educational outcomes for foster care students, and that was heard yesterday. And boy, I'm trying to remember the amendments now because it's been a busy morning. It was passed out of committee.
Some additional reporting.
Reporting as well, but nothing onerous.
Okay. And so that, and then maybe the final bill that I think happened this week that I'm recalling that they'll be interesting is Senate Bill, I believe, 410, the bullying.
That was a bill that required additional reporting and data requirements for your school district. You would have to, post your plans and procedures on your website, who to contact, but then there was also a rather concerning provision that you would have to note the number and types of bullying incidents either in your district, or if each school has a website, they would have to post that data. There was some concern in the committee that especially in the smaller school districts, that quickly becomes identifiable student data. So that was removed during committee discussion, but then there was also quite a bit of discussion about have we talked about what the definition of bullying is, that it's a heartbreaking problem and it's much larger than just posting plans on a website. So the committee ultimately tabled the bill.
Right. And of course, a tabled bill can always be an untabled bill,
That's
but
true.
Particularly since this, I don't believe, is an exempt bill.
Right.
We'd have to check that depending on where it was introduced. That reduces the chance that something might happen this year. However, there is a House bill, although
Yes.
typically the House has been much harder about deadlines than the Senate.
Right.
And so that has not had a hearing in the committee
That's
to this
correct.
point. So continue to monitor this. May just take a moment to explain. KASB last year supported putting together the Blue Ribbon Task
That's
Force,
right.
as did almost all the other organizations, as a way of bringing all the stakeholders together to talk about solutions. Part of our concern about this bill is that it had some provisions that weren't recommended by the committee, that didn't address some of those issues of definitions, and frankly, is there research or best practices of the way to handle
to
this.
help
So
us.
once again, we're not trying to stand in the way of addressing issues of bullying, but just a concern really in some ways about the process and
That's
trying
right.
to make sure we are trying to build a consensus around.
And the
these
committee
areas.
agreed yesterday that this issue needs a lot more work,
Right,
just
so-
not in this bill.
So, and again, I think a continuing issue to all school districts, don't let up on this. This is
Right.
one that's going to continue to draw a great deal of attention. Let's see, a couple of other things in my notes, and we may not try to run through all the arcane bill numbers here. One is the issue of ongoing support for mental health services.
That's right.
So you may remember that over the last two sessions, there have been, roughly $8 to $10 million provided for a pilot mental health program.
That's correct.
Selected districts working with their local community mental health centers to provide kind of year-round, day-round services. The school provides a liaison, specialists are provided by these institutions. All the data extraordinarily successful, a real desire to expand it.
That's right.
But as so often is the case, not an agreement on how to do that. So Governor Kelly in her budget has proposed adding about $4 million to spending this year to continue the program as a competitive grant, not a pilot, but a grant, not named districts, but not enough for everyone, but some expansion, and more providers that could participate, not just community mental health
solely the
centers.
community mental health.
The House Committee on K-12 education, and a member of that, the legislator who's been very active in this, really the champion of doing this, Representative Brenda Landwehr from Wichita, is proposing a bill,
House Bill 2582.
thank you for the number, 2582, that would make this a weighting.
That's correct.
So we now have a situation where we kind of have a competing approach between a competitive grant or a weighting.
That's right.
The weighting, the bill, as we understand with the weighting, would continue to limit it to community mental health providers. It would basically institutionalize the current program.
That's right.
But as a weighting, theoretically, more districts could qualify. Of course, if more districts qualify and money isn't put in, we're
back in
the problem. So we now really have three possible approaches: continue the pilot with or without more money, move to a competitive grant program, as the governor wants, with more money, or go to a weighting with more money if the legislature puts it in. We do not get a reading of a consensus among our membership. I think it's fair to say that we have people supporting various different approaches. We, as a result, did not take a position on the mechanism, but we are strongly supporting of additional funding being put in.
Absolutely.
And hoping the legislature can, again, kind of work with people, get people together to figure out the way that works best for all districts. Maximum flexibility, make the dollars used effectively. So again, the good news is there continues to be a lot of support for this program, but how to expand it kind of a little bit remains to be seen. Moving into a couple of other issues that we have been watching. Let's talk about vaping and those sorts of issues. So you got those?
Was it only yesterday? Yes,
Yes,
I think
was.
it was 2563 was discussed at rather painful length in the House Fed and State. There was quite a bit of discussion, but it was more around some of the T21 aspects, meaning that you couldn't buy cigarettes or vaping materials until you're 21, and then some other additional discussions. So the committee did adopt an amendment conforming the state with federal law, so that would bring the age for smoking and vaping to 21. But the Indoor Clean Air Act provisions that we've been tracking that would allow school districts and others to ban vaping inside their buildings.
Actually would ban it under state law.
Right. Those portions were not affected by the discussion yesterday, and that bill was passed out. Now, the House Judiciary Committee has passed out a sort of vaping only Clean Indoor Air Act bill already. So we now have two bills, one with just the Indoor Clean Air Act and another with T21 and Indoor Clean Air. And we'll have to see what happens.
And so far, unless we've missed it, no action on either in the Senate.
Correct.
So presuming that the House does pass this in some fashion, things will kind of start anew in the Senate. We might want to stick with your friends in the House Judiciary Committee. One bill that is being watched is, if you can find the number real quickly, perhaps the school bus camera bill, which I don't believe has been worked.
Right, and they did discuss it, I believe, late in the afternoon yesterday while you and I were in K-12 ed budget, but they were not going to work it yesterday. They discussed it yesterday because Representative Jim Carlskent, who's behind the bill, was subbing in on Judiciary, and so they wanted to give him a chance to kind of explain to his colleagues what his bill is about. And it's about stop arm cameras and catching speeders.
Yeah, as we understand it, it basically would let the State Board of Education or Department of Education contract with a vendor who would then provide these cameras that you could put on your buses that would then, well, I guess if someone careened around your stop bus, there would be a 2-point video record, which could then be used to fine.
Yeah, it would be a civil fine.
It's not
a traffic ticket.
Not a traffic ticket.
Civil fine.
And what has hung this up in the past is questions of, well, what if I wasn't driving and all? So that's why it went to Judiciary. So again, I think there is a lot of support for this. Still some questions. We'll see Monday.
Still lots of questions.
The other bill in Judiciary, if we kind of slip back to that, I believe is House Bill
2461.
Yes.
Speaking of torturous conversations, that was discussed yesterday. Representative Brad Ralph had a basically what would be a substitute amendment, basically kind of let's substitute my language for what's already in the bill. What it would do would say, okay, school districts, for example, you could enter into an agreement with the law firm for a contingency lawsuit about, and you want to sue the makers of the vaping materials, as some of our districts have done. What his bill would say is you can do that, but then you have to let the Kansas Attorney General's office know that you've entered into this contract. The Attorney General reviews that contract, makes some recommendations to the school district about whether he or she thinks you should move forward, and if the school district kind of rejects that advice, then the Kansas Attorney General has the option to step in and be substituted as the plaintiff in the case. This bill originally would have said the Attorney General is the only one who can enter into these kind of fee arrangements, and school districts, municipalities, you just can't do that. There was quite a bit of discussion around it. There was a lot of confusion, a lot of back and forth. Frankly, there's a lot of lawyers on that committee, so there was a lot of discussion.
Not that there's anything wrong.
Not that there's anything wrong with that. And so the chairman, towards the end of a sometimes contentious afternoon, said, let's sleep on this language over the weekend. We may or may not work this bill on Monday.
A little bit of insight there, of course. Our understanding is that the substitute amendment is based on work the Attorney General did with a number of stakeholders, including KASB attorney Angie Stahlbaumer. It is our understanding, at least, that there was not a agreement on this necessarily. It was a work product where a lot of inputs came together. But I think there are some legislators who are wondering, well, does this mean everyone agreed? And I think our position is we had concerns. Some of those concerns were addressed. That does not necessarily mean that we think the bill, what exactly is the problem we're trying to fix. The Attorney General and some supporters obviously believe there is one. That remains a debatable point, and I think, at least in the case of some school districts, they think that we weren't taking enough action in some of these areas like vaping, and wanted to get directly involved. So there is that companion bill in the Senate.
Senate Bill
444. It has not had a hearing or any action yet. That could certainly come up after turnaround. I believe it's an exempt bill. If it was introduced in federal state, I think it was. It would be.
It's in Judiciary, but
we'll have to double check that. But again, if there is support, a bill can always be worked if there's enough support to work it by the right people. I guess is the easiest way to put that. Okay, we've talked about vaping and tobacco and smoking and lawsuits.
Let's call it a week.
What else? I think, Leah, you're probably
Speaking of
right.
weeks, though,
Yeah.
next week is Public
Yes.
Schools Week, and there are a number of us who are going to be participating throughout the week. There's a social media campaign that will be going on. You can find the toolkit for that, actually, if you want to participate in that, at our KASB website. Go to kasb.org, click on advocacy, and then click on resources and key resources, and you'll see Public Schools Week social media toolkit. Also on Wednesday, we will be having an event at the Kansas Statehouse all day in the second floor rotunda with displays and exhibits by some of the redesigned schools, KASB, USA Kansas will be there, some of our other school districts, some of our allied groups like the Kansas Learning First Alliance, some of the other groups like that will be there just to kind of highlight public schools, thank the legislature for the work they've done to support us, and just have a nice promotional event.
So if you can do some things locally to retweet,
repost,
whatever, this material, that'd be really great, because we kind of try to highlight some of the things we're working on. So as we said, a week from Thursday is the first big deadline, turnaround deadline. The legislature is not scheduled to meet Friday or the following Monday or Tuesday. So a short mini break. When we come back after turnaround, there's really at that point just about 2.5 weeks until the next committee deadline, which doesn't really have a fancy name. Like
I know. I wonder why that is.
But at that point, then we essentially start moving toward conference committee. So believe it or not, as February prepares to end next week, the rest of the regular session will only then be about a month to go. Of course, the veto session is so often when work actually gets done. So, Leah, thank you. Our viewers, thank you. Whenever you do have the chance to view this, if you haven't had a chance to see it live, you can always try to reach us with questions about any of this. We certainly appreciate your support. And certainly, if you have a chance this weekend to see legislators and share comments about these bills, that would be great. Next week, when things wrap up, we'll have a comprehensive report to give you more of an opportunity to focus on things that may be happening during their long break, when many of them will be back in their hometown. So with that, if I can figure out how to stop the screen, the stream end stream, still getting the hang of this. Thank you all. Thanks to our studio audience, and have a good weekend.
Nice job.